So this period of time, these years in the 1980s, are sometimes called the Reagan Revolution or the conservative or Reagan era, because we're really going to see a lot of changes happening, not only in our culture, but our politics and our economy and really everything in between. So first we should start with the economy and Reaganomics. This is really one of the biggest things that Reagan does. He really had two priorities, one at home and one abroad when he was president. At home, it was the economy, and abroad, it was the Cold War. So we'll talk about both of those. We'll start with the economy. So Reaganomics is really just the slang term for supply side economics, which was the economic plan that Ronald Reagan was trying to use to get our country back on track and away from stagflation. So the logic here is that if taxes are reduced, then people will work more because they make more money. Like, I know if you have a part-time job, if you were getting paid more, you'd probably be more, inclined to work more hours because you'd be getting paid more. Then when people have more money, they spend more money. And so businesses will make more money, and then the economy will grow. Now, this means that the government will collect less taxes initially, but in the long run, they'll collect more taxes because more and more people will be getting jobs as businesses grow. So to do this, he has to cut taxes and balance the budget, which was also a really big goal of his. But that's going to require cutting a lot of government programs. When you decrease your income, you've also got to decrease your spending. So that's what he needed to do to cut those programs. So one of the first things he'll do is pass the Economic Recovery Act of 1981, which will reduce taxes by 25% over 3 years. The way this worked is that the 25% is an average, and some people got a little bit more than 20%, and some people got a little bit less than 25%, just depending on their tax bracket. The richest Americans who are in the top tax bracket actually got the largest tax cut. And the reason for that is because wealthy people spend their money a lot differently than you and I do. They invest in businesses which employ more people and stimulate the economy more than just if I get more money back, I'm just going to blow it at Sephora. Very different. So ultimately, to do this, he decides to cut $40 billion from the federal budget, which is absolutely massive. Also, being a conservative, he's going to call for, very large-scale deregulation to help American businesses grow. By the mid-1980s, they're going to have deregulated airlines, telecommunications, and the banking industry. So right in 1980, right before Reagan is able to put any of this into effect, we hit a severe recession. The unemployment rate rose. It went up to more than 10%, and it's going to hit blue-collar workers the hardest. This recession was largely because of those policies that Paul Volcker put in place to stimulate the economy in the late 1970s. He rose interest rates. The problem is that those interest rates were left in place too long, and they ended up hurting us. They helped for a little while, but then they hurt because we didn't remove them in time, thanks Jimmy Carter. Luckily, though, in 1983, Reagan's policies started kicking in, and the economy got much better. Inflation fell dramatically, as did unemployment. The GNP began to rise, showing the success of American businesses. GNP is the gross national product. So even though things were getting better overall, the physical number of people that we have, poor people that we have in the United States, actually increased. But that was because of the amount of immigration we're getting from Latin America. The majority of the immigrants coming from Latin America were part of that lowest class. So as more of them are moving here, that number of people that we have in that bracket is increasing, even though our economy is getting better as a whole. So if you ever see that number and you get confused, that's why. So I told you his other priority was to end the Cold War. That was really his, these were his number 1 and 2 thing, the economy and the Cold War. So to work to end the Cold War, he increased defense spending. And I'll talk more about what exactly he was spending it on in a minute. But that increase in defense spending is going to require us to make other budget cuts because he wanted to keep that budget balanced. If I'm going to move to a fancier apartment and spend more money on my rent, I have to spend less money on gas and food to balance that out. So he submits a proposal to increase the defensive budget, and he submits a proposal to cut different programs to make up for it. Unfortunately, though, Congress agrees to the increase in defense spending, but they don't want to cut all these programs to make up for the cost. So they don't approve that. And in the end, that now we're just spending more money, and not, we're not cutting anything. We're just spending more money. So it's going to cause our national debt to rise to about $2.5 trillion, which was very, very high. So this is very upsetting to Reagan. He was not happy that we weren't balancing our budget. So he gets Congress to pass something called the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Act in 1985. And this bill said that a budget had to be balanced by the year 1990. And if our debt got too high before we balanced that budget, then automatic cuts would kick in, essentially forcing Congress to balance a budget. Now, in 1989, we're going to hit another economic snag called the savings and loan crisis. In the late 80s, around 1,000 savings and loans banks failed. This was due to fraudulent behavior as well as risky loans. And if you're wondering what a risky loan is, this is granting a loan to someone who's not likely to pay it back. It might mean that they are asking for a business loan for a bad business idea and they give it to them anyway, or they're asking for a home loan and they aren't employed, so they don't have necessarily the income to pay that loan back. So those are just two examples of a risky loan. So to prevent more panic, we talked about runs on banks before and bank failures, and it's very easy for that type of situation to spiral out of control. So to prevent things from getting worse, Congress voted to spend money and bail out these banks, totaling a $200 billion bailout. That's more money than we spent on the Vietnam War, to put things into perspective. So that was really, really difficult, and unfortunately, we're not really going to learn from it, and we're going to keep up with the trend of bailing companies and banks out as we get into later years. But Reagan was reelected in 1984 overwhelmingly once again. Other things he'll do in his presidency is he will appoint several conservative judges to the Supreme Court, including Sandra Day O'Connor, who will be our first female Supreme Court justice. And his popularity is going to really grow, and it will allow him to get his vice president elected president in 1988, George Herbert Walker Bush. So Bush Sr. will be elected in 1988. All right, so now let's talk about his other priority, which was, before we talk about his other priority, I do have this one political scandal here, which I do want to make sure and mention, which was, on everyone's TV and mind in the 1980s, and it's called the Iran-Contra affair. So remember I told you we were supporting anti-communist groups all over the place. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But one anti-communist group that we have been supporting was in Nicaragua. Remember when Jimmy Carter pulled support from the dictator in Nicaragua, it allowed for a revolution to take place. Well, one of the groups trying to take power was a communist group, and we didn't want that to happen. So when Reagan gets into office, we began supporting the other group who wants a democracy, and they're called the Contras. Here's a picture of the Contras right here. So we wanted to keep funding the Contras, but in the late 80s, or I guess I would say mid-80s is a little more accurate, Congress passed a bill saying we were no longer going to send money to the Contras because we had sent enough. So Reagan's administration wasn't very happy about this because, as I said, communism and the Cold War is their number one priority. So they are unhappy that we are no longer going to be helping the Contras. While this is a problem, on the other hand, we're also having issues with Iran. So you remember the hostage thing? It's been a whole deal. We're still not on great terms with Iran. And there is a militant terrorist group in Iran called Hezbollah, which I've got a photograph of as well. This is Hezbollah. So in the 1980s, Hezbollah kidnapped 7 Americans, and we wanted to do everything we could to get them back. And so the Secretary of Defense, General Oliver North, came to Reagan with a plan and was like, my plan isn't exactly legal, but it's a plan to get the hostages back. And Reagan was like, don't tell me what the plan is, just do it. Just do whatever you got to do. The less I know, the better. So here's the plan. What he's going to do is get the hostages back and simultaneously figure out a way to help the Contras at the same time. So step 1 is we are going to sell weapons to Israel. After that, step 2, we will take the money we make from that weapons sale and give it to the Contras so that we can help fund the Contras without having to pull money from someplace else and draw attention to that. Step 3, get Israel to take those weapons and trade them for the hostages with Hezbollah. And then step 4, Israel give us our hostages back. And Israel agrees to this, and they do it. They make the trade, they get our hostages back, and everyone just thinks that this all was just something that Israel did. You know, they just got our hostages back for us. Thanks. That's wonderful. But eventually, attention got drawn to this entire conspiracy, and the question became, you know, did Reagan give the order to violate the law by not only illegally funding the Contras, but also negotiating with terrorists, and also ultimately sending weapons to a terrorist organization to get our hostages back? So there was a lot of back and forth on Reagan's top guys. Some of them said he knew, some of them said he didn't know. Oliver North got on TV and said that, you know, he was authorized to do everything that he did. Ultimately, every single organization who had been put together to investigate this and investigate Reagan, including Senate and the Democrats in the House, they all came back saying there's no evidence at all that Reagan 100% gave the order to do all of these things. Now, he may have said get the hostages back, but he didn't say to do all of this stuff. So Reagan was cleared, and a lot of other people were charged with crimes, and but no one is going to end up going to jail, because a couple will get dropped, and then the few who don't get dropped will all be pardoned by Bush Sr. on one of his last days in office. So now for the last piece of Reagan's puzzle, which is the Cold War. So this is the Cold War is going to end for a variety of reasons here, that Reagan's going to have it all sort of like pieced together very carefully. But the key to all of this is a massive building up of our military. That we're going to see the largest peacetime military buildup in American history here. The thing is that Reagan knows that the USSR can't afford to spend as much money on their defense as we can. And when we build up our military, it makes them think they need to also. So they stop spending money on other things that they might need. So in building all of this up, we talk about a lot of new defensive initiatives, one of which ended up being very famous. We ended up not going through with it, but we do talk about it. It was, you know, everyone was talking about it in the 80s, and it's called SDI, which stands for Strategic Defense Initiative. And basically what we were going to do is we were going to put lasers in outer space on satellites and on land to shoot any missiles that were aimed at the United States before they could get to us. Literally space lasers. So a lot of the critics of this whole idea called it Star Wars and said that it was unrealistic. So ultimately we don't do it. But I personally think that was a missed opportunity. Space lasers sound really cool. The other thing that we're going to be doing is aiding anti-communist groups all over the world. Now, we've already talked about how we aided the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and the Contras in Nicaragua. We're also going to be helping the anti-communist groups in El Salvador on the condition that they improve their human rights in order to receive aid from us, which is one thing that I'm sure Jimmy Carter would have been proud of. And another example is when we get involved in defending this tiny little island right here called Grenada. So Cuba had helped leftist radicals and communists go into Grenada and overthrow their prime minister to put a communist government in place. Obviously, we don't want this to happen. So in 1983, we send U.S. troops to the island of Grenada to prevent it from being taken over by communists. This ends up sort of being a joke because there's only 91,000 people that live on the whole island. That is smaller than Greensboro, okay? And we're sending the entire U.S. Army. So it was obviously an overwhelming, easy victory for us. Today, the U.S. government calls something a Grenada when it's a surefire win for the U.S. Another reason why the Cold War is going to come to an end with Reagan will be this guy right here, Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev becomes the new leader of the USSR in 1985 after Nikita Khrushchev, and he will do two things initially. The first is institute a new policy called Glasnost, Glasnost, which means a new openness, so a new relationship with the rest of the world, which is awesome. And the next thing is called Perestroika, which is reforming the Soviet system of a state-controlled economy, helping them to become have less of a communist-controlled economy.